Okay, so just a couple of things. Don't forget the web activities due today. And if you haven't gotten it done, the Coral Reef Adventure video is also due today. So try to get those done. And also we're going to have a test next week. We're finishing our notes today. Monday, I'll have a study guide for you. Tuesday, Wednesday, we'll do the Kahoot, and then Thursday, Friday, we'll take the test. All right, any questions about that? The test is going to cover everything from phylum Porifera to what we covered today. Okay, so nobody has any questions, we'll go ahead and get started. Let's see. Okay, someone asked me how hard the test is going to be. If you do the study guide and you learn everything on the study guide, it will not be hard. It's going to be all straight from the study guide and straight from the Kahoot. So if you pay attention to those, do the study guide and learn the stuff on it, it won't be hard. Okay? There we go. Okay, so class Anthozoa. So we're still working on phylum Cnidaria. We talked about the jellyfish. We've talked about the hydrozoans. And now we're going to talk about the sea anemones and corals. One thing you will need to know on the test are all of these phylum, the classes and phylum names and everything. So. Okay, so Anthozoa means flower animal. Antho means flower. And sea anemones, an anemone is a flower. We don't hear about them much here, but sea anemone basically is a sea flower. So unlike the jellyfish, there's only the polyp stage. There's no medusa stage. So the attached form, not the swimming form. Okay. No alteration of generation and no medusa swimming around. They can be solitary or colonial. There's sea anemones that are typically solitary, and then the corals, which are typically colonial. They'll be actually connected to each other. They have a gastrovascular cavity. It's subdivided by partitions or walls called septa. And all the Anthozoa are marine. There are no freshwater Anthozoa. And the first poll question. Remember, these are for a grade. Somebody's not answering. You have about 5 seconds left. Okay. All right, most of you got that right. Very good. They do not have the medusa stage. Okay, so here's just some examples. This is a sea anemone. This is one of the large ones, like there was in Finding Nemo that the clownfish lived in. And here's a diagram. You'll probably see something like this on the test. The diagram, there's a petal disc. There's an oral disc. This is where the mouth is. This is where it's attached. Ped means foot. Then the gastrovascular cavity, there's the septa, and these are called septal filaments. They are used to help digest the food. And in corals, they can actually use it to fight the other corals, believe it or not. Okay, here's another anemone, purple-tipped anemone. So here's a coral. Coral is a colony of polyps. Some of them, not all, secrete a calcium carbonate skeleton. And this is how it works. There's a calcium carbonate skeleton. The polyp has a little pocket it sits in. And there's its mouth, the gastrovascular cavity, the dividing walls or the septum, and there's the septal filaments, which we'll see more later. And of course the tentacles. So here's finger coral. It's a picture taken at night when the polyps are extended and feeding. So millions of corals over thousands of years produce reefs. And some of them are quite large. The Great Barrier Reef can be seen from space. It covers this area. And depending on how high you are, it's one of the few things made by living creatures that you can actually see from space. So here's a picture of a brain coral taken during the day when the polyps are retracted. And at night, the polyps are extended. All right, so healthy coral is a golden brown color due to the presence of a symbiotic zooxanthellae. That's a big word, but it's an algae, like a plant. It provides much of the coral's nutrients. So it lives inside the tissues of the coral, and that's where the coral gets, some of the corals get most of their nutrition from those algae. They don't use their polyps to catch food very much at all. So much so that if they lose a zooxanthellae, they can actually starve to death. And the way they grow is specifically to provide the zooxanthellae as much light as possible. So what are zooxanthellae? Hey, quite a few of you missed that one. It's actually a symbiotic algae. Okay. Okay, so corals are animals, so they can get diseases. This is a disease called black band disease, and it's actually caused by an algae, not the symbiotic algae, a different kind. And as it grows across the coral, it leaves this black band with a white band behind it. The white band is dead coral, and the black band is the algae. So they have wide branches that extend upward to catch the sunlight for the zooxanthellae in the coral tissues. So here's a close-up of the coral. You can see the tentacles and the edges. Some of them have very large polyps. Most of the ones we've been looking at have small ones, but these have very large polyps. Again, here's one with the polyps retracted, and there's the polyps extended. This is orange cup coral. Okay, so this is an aerial view of a reef around Fiji. So this is deep water, and then you have the reef. And the reef can sometimes be hundreds of feet high. And so there's a steep drop off at the edge. And you can see this is all the reef in very shallow water. since most of the corals need the sunlight for their zooxanthellae. They usually live in shallow water. There's a couple of places where they live in deeper waters. But this is the calcium carbonate skeleton. For a long time, corals were harvested for the skeleton, which isn't sustainable because it takes a very long time for them to grow. So if you break off a big piece of coral, dry it, bleach it, and sell it to tourists, it doesn't come back very fast. Okay, coral bleaching. This is when the zooxanthellae are lost, and it's caused by higher water temperatures. So the zooxanthellae are kicked out. I'm going to show you a video that explains why. The coral turns white, and they've lost a huge percentage of their nutrition. That happens with the water, and the algae can recolonize the coral, but if it doesn't happen quick enough, the coral can die.
This is an article published by The Guardian back in 2014. It's an obituary for Australia's Great Barrier Reef. 2 years later, Outside magazine published this. It's another obituary for the reef. And more recently, we got this news.
And also this hour, the Great Barrier Reef is at a terminal stage.
Have we really killed the Great Barrier Reef? The answer is no, but we sure are trying. It'd be hard to call the time of death for the Great Barrier Reef because it's actually some 3,000 reefs spread over an area the size of Italy. So there's plenty of room right now for there to be widespread damage and lots of relatively healthy reefs. That's something dive operators there really want you to know.
The contrasting colors down there and the water, and when the light hits, the different colors just stand out. It's absolutely amazing.
But the world's coral reefs, including the Great Barrier Reef, have had a really hard time the past few years. After decades of degradation from local threats like pollution and overfishing, coral reefs have now undergone a record-breaking global bleaching event. That's when coral turns white, which puts them at a high risk of dying. It started in 2014 during the Northern Hemisphere summer. Abnormally warm water caused corals in Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands to start bleaching en masse. By the end of 2014, corals around Hawaii, Florida, and the Marshall Islands were bleaching too. When summer came around in the Southern Hemisphere, bleaching spread to coral reefs in the South Pacific and Indian Ocean. And towards the end of 2015, corals throughout the Caribbean were bleached too. Hawaii's corals bleached for a second time. By now, El Niño was in full force, and when combined with global warming, it kept sea temperatures high enough to continue the bleaching event into 2016, hitting corals in Asia, the west coast of Africa, and the Great Barrier Reef too. The worst bleaching, in fact, that the Great Barrier Reef had ever seen. Bleaching continued into 2017 when the Great Barrier Reef was hit again.
Australia's Great Barrier Reef in grave condition tonight.
For the second year in a row, this video showing the bleaching.
2/3 of the Great Barrier Reef has now been devastated by severe coral bleaching, which is caused by rising water temperatures.
Researchers first documented global coral bleaching in 1998, a record warm year. And it happened again in 2010, but this third coral bleaching event is by far the worst. And looking at this temperature trend, you can get why people are starting to say goodbye to coral reefs. But to really get what makes them vulnerable, you have to understand how coral reefs work. Corals are related to jellyfish and sea anemones, but you've probably noticed that they don't look quite as squishy. There's a couple reasons for that. For one thing, they live in colonies. Each coral structure is made of hundreds or thousands of individual coral animals called polyps. Each of these little bumps is where a polyp lives. They're easy to overlook if you're snorkeling, but if you look closely, you can see them, especially at night when they're less likely to be hiding. Those polyps build a skeleton together. Not all corals do this, but the ones that build reefs do so by creating a calcium carbonate skeleton underneath them, layer by layer. So the living polyps sit in little cups on top of an ever-expanding skeleton structure, which in turn sits on top of the compacted skeletons of previous corals from thousands of years ago, otherwise known as limestone. By building these structures with all these nooks and crannies, corals provide homes for thousands of other animals and plants, an estimated 25% of all marine species, even though they take up less than 1% of the ocean floor. Those reefs provide billions of dollars worth of economic value to people every year through fisheries, tourism, and protection from storm waves. But here's the thing. Corals can't build reefs on their own. Coral reefs exist because of an incredible partnership between animal and plant. That's because reef-building corals get the majority of their energy and nutrients from single-celled algae that live inside the coral polyps. It's where they get their greenish-brown color too. They're called zooxanthellae, and like other plants, they get their energy from sunlight. That's why coral reefs mostly grow near the surface of the ocean, where the sun shines. But this partnership breaks down under heat stress. After multiple weeks of temperatures, even just a couple of degrees Celsius hotter than the maximum temperatures that they're used to, the photosynthetic system in the algae starts to accumulate reactive oxygen molecules like hydrogen peroxide, which leak into the coral polyp cells. To protect themselves from damage, the coral polyps kick the algae out of their bodies, leaving the pale skeleton showing through. By warming up the planet, we are, among many other things, breaking up the team that built the ocean's most diverse ecosystem. But bleached corals don't necessarily die. What happens next depends on how severe and long-lasting the high temperatures are. When researchers assessed the damage to the Great Barrier Reef in 2016, they found that coral death was concentrated in the northern section of the reef, where bleaching had been the most severe. In the central section, 33% of the reefs bleached severely, but there was only around 6% mortality. That's because zooxanthellae can return to a coral colony within a few weeks if the water cools back down fast enough. If not, the coral dies from starvation or disease. If enough coral colonies die, a reef can get taken over by fuzzy brown seaweed. Some coral reefs have transformed into this. If there are enough fish and other grazers to eat up the seaweed, new coral larvae can settle there and the reef can start building up again. After the 1998 bleaching, the corals of the Great Barrier Reef eventually recovered. But it takes a decade or more for even the fastest growing corals to build back up. And that 10-year timeline assumes one very important condition, that they don't bleach all over again, and they almost certainly will. Climate models project that in the coming decades, the conditions now causing mass bleaching will become increasingly frequent, until eventually they happen every summer. How soon that happens depends a lot on whether we start cutting our greenhouse gas emissions. If we don't, annual bleaching conditions are projected for parts of the Great Barrier Reef by mid-century. At that point, few coral reefs could survive. If we buy them more time by slowing down global warming, corals and their zooxanthellae may be able to acclimate or eventually evolve to tolerate warmer weather. Coral reefs would still change and probably still shrink, but we could give them a better chance. That's why it doesn't make sense to pronounce them dead. This ecosystem is dynamic. There are forces building it up that are battling the forces tearing it down, and those factors vary by species and by location. But with global warming, humans have sided against the world's coral reefs to an unprecedented degree. Some of that damage is now unavoidable. But the battle isn't over, and it's not too late for us to switch sides. If you'd like to learn more about what climate change is doing to the biodiversity of our planet,
what causes coral bleaching? There we go. Okay, so coral bleaching is caused by warmer water temperatures. Okay, so this is what I was talking about earlier. When two corals get close to each other, they actually fight. Coral aggression happens when one coral tries to get too close to the other one. And you get this dead zone between them, where one coral has digested the polyps of the other one. And they do this by basically throwing up their guts, those septal filaments, onto the other coral and using their digestive enzymes to kill those polyps. Here's how this works. It's sped up a lot. This would probably take hours.
Inevitably, the corals begin to overgrow each other, and that means trouble. When neighbors get too close, they detect one another's presence chemically. The aggressor, on the right, prepares for battle. The polyps extrude their guts and simply digest their rivals alive. A no-man's land, a band of white skeleton, is the only evidence of the night's border dispute.
Okay, so here's some other types of corals. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so this is a sea fan. And there's a snail called a flamingo tongue, interestingly enough, that eats the polyps from the sea fan. Now, what's weird about this, when I first picked one up, it really kind of freaked me out because I picked it up, it looked like this. I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. And I carried it for a little ways, and then I looked down and it was white. All the spots were gone. I said, how in the world can a shell change colors? Well, the spots are not actually part of the shell. It's part of the snail's body. It's the mantle that is spread across the surface of the shell. And then when it's scared, it retracts that into this inside the shell to protect itself. Very strange. There's a sea pen. Another one. This is called corky sea fingers, and I show it to you because it's a real good example of the polyps extended and when they're retracted. Okay, so in this unit we talked about phylum Porifera, which are the sponges, phylum Cnidaria, which were the jellyfish and the sea anemones, and now we're going to talk about phylum Ctenophora, another one with a silent C. And these are the comb jellies. It's a small phylum, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we're going to finish up the unit with it. And here's a quick introduction.
Be warned, this is what happens when you eat too many Skittles, or sprinkles, or maybe adult brownies. Or, even better, all three at once. This is the ocean's majestic comb jelly. You'd think that those rippling bands of colors would be a case of bioluminescence, which so many sea creatures deploy. But in reality, this has more to do with the critter's locomotion. Like jellyfish, comb jellies are squishy and lack a brain, though they do have a nervous system and sensors for orientation. But they get around a bit differently than jellyfish, and that's where the light show comes in. While jellyfish swim with those famous full-body contractions, the comb jelly moves around with special flittering hairs called cilia. When white light hits these filaments, it's broken out into its different colors, hence the "I've eaten way too many Skittles" effect. But oddly enough, this probably never happens with regular old light from the sun. Scientists have to hit them with beams from submersibles in order to get the shimmering. Comb jellies have tentacles just like true jellyfish, but theirs are sticky as opposed to stinging. Depending on the species, some will dangle long lines to snag food, including tiny plankton. Others have smaller tentacles around their mouths to catch prey, like the world's most badass beard. Yeah, you heard me, Chuck Norris. And still others have cilia that are modified into serrated teeth. These species eat other jellies, using their chompers to ratchet themselves over their victims. Think of comb jellies as the spiders of the sea. Arachnids have all kinds of strategies for hunting, from those with classic webs to the trapdoor spider, which ambushes its prey from a den. Comb jellies are diverse like that, only they can swim real good and they look like they're made out of rainbows and happiness. Kind of like me.
Okay, so something they got not quite right about that when he's talking about the sunlight never shining on them, that's only the shallow water, the deep sea ones. There's coast ones in the shallow water that get sunlight all the time, and you can find them on the beach. I used to find them a lot when I was going to college in Galveston. So some characteristics, there's around 100 species. They have those comb plates. They have a complete digestive system, a mouth and an anus. This is the first group we've talked about like that. The cnidarians just had a one-way digestive system, so they ate, they digest, and then they throw it up. Ctenophores are pretty much like the rest of the animals that you think of that have a mouth and an anus. They have longitudinally arranged fused cilia that they beat back and forth to move through the water. No nematocysts, they don't sting. No stinging cells. Some of them have the two long tentacles. They have radial symmetry like the cnidarians. Two tissue layers with the mesoglia in between, just like the cnidarians. But they have glue cells on the tentacles, colloblasts. So this is very different. And that's what they use to catch microscopic prey. They also do have sensory organs. They have statocysts, which is basically what you have in your inner ear. So if someone blindfolded you and turned you upside down, you would know you're upside down. And that's because you have this organ in your inner ear that helps you know which way is up. And they have the same, something very similar. It's for balance and orientation. Here's some examples. Okay, so what is in phylum Ctenophora? Okay. Very good. Most of you got that. Jellyfish are cnidaria. Comb jellies are Ctenophora. Here's some examples. This is what the ones that I used to find on the beach look like. This species is bioluminescent too. So in addition to the iridescence on the cilia, if you pick them up at night and touch them, they glow a blue-green color. They're very, very cool. There's some different examples. And this one's really odd. This one is ribbon-shaped. That. Okay, so that's all for today. Don't forget the assignments that are due today. And if you think you need to start studying for the test, I will have the study guide up at least by Monday. I may get it up sooner than that. So it'll be in the Monday folder for next week if you want to get a jump start on it. Anyway, that's all I have. You're free to go unless you have any questions.